I never really liked Dr. Bones. His writing on gods and radicals always came across to me like the cocky self-mythologizing of an occultist entirely too high on his own bullshit, which is to say it reminded me too much of my own early writings to ever be a comfy read. So in a sense I was immune to the shock that went through left-wing communities when Twitter user Bonhomme came forward to say that Bones had groomed and sexually assaulted them. I only found out all this had happened after watching Angie Speaks' live stream, venting about the acrimonious fallout from the revelations. Angie, who'd interviewed Bones before the allegations became known, was clearly and rightly distressed and angered by the whole situation. I could relate. A couple of years ago, I experienced a complex traumatic incident which has left me struggling with mental illness to this day. Without wanting to go too much into the trauma of the incident itself, an important factor in the incident was the context in which it occurred, which was the fallout from a situation in which certain figures in the spoken word community were alleged to have engaged in abusive behaviour towards other artists. As embarrassing as it sounds to say these revelations destroyed my faith in poetry, it's still true to an extent. I got back into writing properly around 8 years ago, around the same time as I came out as transgender, and gravitated towards the then growing UK spoken word scene because it had charismatic performers and an electrifying, inspiring energy. The scene then had a quality of mission about it, a sense in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis and the eruption of movements like Occupy and the Arab Spring, that we were engaged in a profound struggle to create a better and more open world. In the introduction to his collection Wizard, the poet Dominic Berry wrote about how the Manchester spoken word scene had seemed a safer and more welcoming space to him as a young queer man recovering from mental illness than that city's more renowned but sometimes highly toxic gay scene. That resonated with me. After I came out as trans, the poet Dagna Stone was the first person to introduce me as she for a gig at the Live Theatre in Newcastle. The scene was good, the scene was welcoming, and there was a strong sense that the scene was centred around a shared politics that was broadly in favour of gender equality, of varied gender expression and sexuality, and of the importance of consent in a world which tried, too often, on all levels, to deny it. I know that it sounds appallingly naive in retrospect, but one of the things about that scene which sustained me was the feeling of making common cause, of being involved with others in a struggle to tear down what was wrong with the world and make a better one. Maybe our only weapons were pile-ups of internal rhymes and offbeat rhythms, and the only killings we committed were on stage, but it felt kinda like war, only better, because we intended to kill with the kindness of call-outs and avoid the messy, ethical compromises which drag down those who really go to war. War's role in the development of new technologies is well known. Radar, plastic surgery, satellite navigation systems, smartphones, and the internet all owe something to the bloody history of national struggles, however much apostles of the free market may try to claim otherwise. But war has also played a key role in the development of psychology. The concept of nostalgia, a compound of the Greek nostos, or homecoming, and algos, or pain, was first diagnosed by a 17th century medical student based on observation of the anxieties of Swiss mercenaries fighting far from home. More recently, the concept of PTSD has provided a useful diagnostic and treatment framework for those suffering from the trauma of modern warfare. In both cases, what was originally a military coinage was recognised to be applicable equally in a number of civilian contexts. British expats in Valencia or Murcia, many of whom may themselves be mercenaries of a more homegrown variety, feel nostalgia every bit as much as Swiss pikemen. Similarly, PTSD has fanned out to include victims of sexual, emotional, or colonial trauma, as well as battle fatigue. In recent years, however, military research into PTSD has begun to explore more complex terrain. The diagnostic criteria for PTSD require that the patient should themselves have been exposed to sexual violence, abuse, or acute or repeated near-death situations. However, some in military patient cohorts, most notably drone operators who, due to the technology involved, rarely have to be physically present in the theatre of conflict, have presented clinically with symptoms similar to those of PTSD without themselves having experienced direct trauma. This led the psychiatrist Jonathan Shea to coin the term moral injury to characterize the psychological trauma which arises not from exposure to a traumatic physical environment, but from being forced to violate or to witness the violation of what they deem to be the moral order of the world. Brett T. Litz and his colleagues, in their review of currently available studies on the topic, define moral injury as perpetrating, failing to prevent, bearing witness to, or learning about acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. For Litz, the cognitive dissonance created by being in some way party to the destruction of one's moral order can result in shame, guilt, or anxiety, which leads the patient to withdraw from others and renders them vulnerable to suicide and various forms of self-harm and self-sabotaging behaviours, effects very similar to those of PTSD, with which moral injury is often comorbid. It might seem a bit distasteful to be considering the trauma of unmanned drone operators when the deadly toys they pilot can result in much worse trauma for people on the ground, but in a way, it's kind of a good thing. The history of military psychology, after all, is the history of an establishment continually trying to find ways to overcome the extreme reluctance of most people to kill, to train people out of benevolent behaviours and depersonalise, industrialise and collectivise the business of killing. Think of all those firing squad soldiers clinging to the belief that theirs was the blank firing rifle. The moral injury suffered by drone pilots is, in its way, proof that human revulsion against murder can still be felt even when every effort has been made by the military structure to keep the dirty truth of combat at a distance. Even in an age of Baudrillardian hyper-simulation, it seems some of us are still capable of distinguishing between killing in a video game and blowing up a real person's house. But what does all this have to do with my disenchantment with the spoken word scene? Well, Shea sees moral injury as developing due to the betrayal of what's right in a high-stakes situation by someone who holds power. Well, what situation is more high stakes than trying to change the world? And who has more power over us than those we idolize? When I began doing research for this video, I was expecting to find sources on moral injury hard to find because the term was new to me. I was fairly confident that I would find lots of resources on activist burnout, because that was a term I was much more familiar with. Well, it seems like a lot of people think the same way, because there was a very clear difference in the results the two searchers returned. Search results for moral injury returned a Wikipedia page for the concept, as well as links to the work of Shea, Litz, et al. Search results for activist burnout returned results overwhelmingly focused from an activist point of view on preventing or recovering from the condition. Obviously, one of the main reasons for this is the difference in communities around the terms. The military has a disturbingly obvious reason to research moral injury, way more money to throw at that research than grassroots activists who have to prioritise organising and caring for ourselves and each other, so most of the sources on activist burnout don't spend a lot of time on definitions, assuming that anyone reading the sources will already have a functional definition and be interested in finding resources to deal with it. That's probably a good approach for the most part. But by focusing more on outlining heuristic methods of self-care, we neglect the potentially useful area of investigating how activist burnout differs from its corporate equivalent, for example. And I think moral injury might be a key element in that distinction. I think one way in which being burned out on activism differs from being burned out from a job is that we often feel a sense of moral unity with those with whom we organise, in a sense we perhaps don't with ordinary co-workers. We also, for obvious reasons, see our work as being pretty high stakes. Depending on the cause we organise around, failure to succeed can lead to lost jobs, lost rights, lost lives, or, as in the case of climate activism, the loss of a livable planet. This isn't procedural tinkering. Our failure can have drastic consequences. So, as activists, we find ourselves in a high-stakes situation. And sadly, too often we witness the other requirement for moral injury, the betrayal of our ethical sense of the world from those to whom we extend authority. I started this video with the example of the recent Dr. Bones controversy. To give another, more personal example, I don't really know if, as a trans woman, I actually have lost count of the number of cis feminist activists I've otherwise admired who later turned out to hate trans people, but I do know counting them up would be depressing. As activists, we run the risk of burnout simply because of the amount of work it takes to be an activist in this world. As I said near the start of this video, I'm currently recovering from mental health issues, and making this video has taken 3 weeks, including a day of footage hunting and editing which lasted for 12 hours on Tuesday and left me absolutely drained for the rest of the week. And this is a really lazy activist contribution. I'm not organising protests or getting out on the streets fighting Nazis or, doing trade union representation for people. This is fairly easy. Just on its own, labouring to make the world a better place is hard enough when you're also a prisoner of a capitalist system which forces you to labour just to survive. But I think if we also acknowledge the role of moral injury in activist burnouts, we may be able to find better ways to help ourselves and our comrades to recover. I'm not saying everything we think we know about activist burnout is wrong, just that if we incorporate the concept of moral injury into how we talk about it, we may actually be able to understand it better. And that's that. Thank you for watching. I really enjoyed the process of working on this. It's always interesting doing something that's more complicated than just the poetry videos. And it felt like this might be a useful contribution. I do see it as very much a starting contribution, so if you have anything to say or any thoughts on this, I'd really love to actually see those in the comments. Obligatory, if you like this, please like, share and subscribe thing. There's a link to my Patreon and my one-off donation page in the comments if you are one of those people who gets off on showing your enjoyment for things financially. Whatever the case, I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you again soon. Thank you for watching. Cheers. Bye.